Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me because I have my microphone on and sometimes it doesn't work. But before I get started, I want to mention that if you go to my website that's in the description, you can sign up to get your own free copy of the first chapter of my book so that you get notifications when it goes live, when it's available on Amazon, I mean. Which will happen in the next week or so. So I'm super excited for that. So without further ado, let's dive in. I need to share my screen. Yep. All right, let's pull that up. All right. So, welcome to my book launch for Out of the Dark. I am super excited for this, and I've been looking forward to it my whole life, basically, of uh, just getting one of my videos out there. It's been a huge dream of mine. It's finally happening. So let's go ahead and watch the trailer. So if you've seen some of my trailers, this is the 2-minute-ish ones for it. So let's go ahead and play that.
I came here as a boy, Astrid, whenever things weighed on my mind. Now I'm showing you. And remember that no matter what, I'll always be here.
That was the first time. And this was the last.
On the raid, I met a monk. He was unafraid even of death. What god did he have that made him like that?
Sven, forget about him. Your questions will bring the gods' wrath on us. All I've loved is gone. If only Sven knew where our questions would lead. If only he knew. God of the Christians, help me.
If you believe in this God, is hating the Danes the right thing to do?
Don't bring God into this. He has nothing to do with it.
All right. So hopefully you were able to hear that. So let's go to the third slide. So for this, I wanted to go through kind of the process of what it was like to write this book. And we'll start off with the first notebook here that you see, the one with the lion. This was a gift given to me by one of my aunts for Christmas. And I had never received anything like that. And it was just so beautiful. I wanted to do something special with it. And I thought, why not write a book about it? So you guys probably don't know, but I've been writing books, stories my whole entire life. I I wrote my first book at 7 years old. It was like this. It's very humorous to look at it now, but it was a full illustrated, had a whole plot line to it and everything. And that was the first spark. Before that, I had elaborate game setups and stuff with my dolls in my dollhouse. But after that first book, I really enjoyed writing down my own little stories and um, just doing stuff with it. And there's just something satisfying, like really satisfying about writing down a story and be like, "Hey, I wrote this. I made this up myself." And I always really enjoyed that aspect of storytelling, and also just the almost surreal nature of writing is very like that's the whole reason why I do it. Part of the time is just the magical feeling you get when you're writing. Um, to me, it's more powerful than reading, if that is believable. And so I always enjoyed that. And what inspired this book, the Out of the Dark, was actually How to Train Your Dragon. So if any of my family's watching this, yes, it was How to Train Dragon. I am serious. That's what got me interested in dragons and Vikings. I'd always been a little interested because they're cool. But after watching How to Train Dragon and seeing some of the episodes of, I believe it was Race to the Edge, I watched most of them, like maybe half of them, whenever I could. And that just sparked a real interest. And that was the first time I had seen episodes of movies and stuff. So that led to me making up my own at bedtime. And so when I received this notebook that I got, I was like, "Hey, I could do that. I've already been making up Viking tales and whatnot, so why not write a book, right?" So the original one was 33,000 words. It was, I believe, 14 chapters, and now it is 89,000 words and 26 chapters, I believe. It might be 28. I cannot remember, but it has gotten really big since then, since when I first wrote it. When I first wrote it, I had no idea what I was doing. I was just like, "Oh yeah, I'll just write and think of things as I go along." That's how I originally did it, and it was awful. Reading it again, it was awful. But eh, you just you learn as you go. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know about plot structure or theme or anything about characters. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But I edited as much as I could, and that's where the second notebook is, the one that says Brave and True. That was the original title. And it was kind of a forced title because I thought, man, this book has to be about something, after I was done writing it. Um, and then I forced the theme into the book and I did edits, which is more like copy editing, all the grammar and spelling. And then I just left it alone for years. But this first spiral bound notebook in the middle there, that was printed out by my parents for me, and it was a huge surprise, and I loved it so much. And it's actually the reason why I edited and am publishing the book today, um, now, because I was going through my bookshelf one day and I was I picked it up and I was like, "Hey, look at that. That's my old book." So I flipped through it and I was reading and I found myself engrossed in the characters in the world again. And I was like, what if what if I can save this book? What if I can get this to work and I can actually do this again and make it a real book? So that's when I dug up the old files on the computer and started editing. That was in 2023, I believe. No, no, I think it was 2022 because I graduated in 23, met my first author in May of 2023, and I remember distinctly telling him that I've been editing a book of mine and I don't really know what I'm doing. And so he said, "Hey, how about you go check out KM Weiland's website?" That's how I found out about helping writers become authors.com. When this is over, I can put that in the description for you guys. Um, but that was the first time I got any training or knowledge in the writing craft. And then I added scenes, tweaked scenes, edited until you see the last notebook um, in the slide here. And that thing is like an inch thick with all the papers that I added in. Plus, it was like maybe 85,000 words when I got this printed. And you can see I did a ton of work with that. I had water spilled on it. I got all this marker in there in the bottom of the table of contents. It was a lot of work. And I did more even after that. I probably did 5 edits at least of this book. But as you saw in the trailer, it's about this Viking girl who grew up as the daughter of her her village's chief, and she had a very peaceful life, was a little spoiled, and then she is faced with a marriage that she doesn't want to go through on because the guy she's going to marry is her childhood nemesis. And so she tries to avoid it, and then her brother Sven comes back from a raid, and he says, "You know what? I don't know what to believe anymore." And she's like, "What do you mean?" And so that was uh, a huge shakeup um, of her own beliefs and stuff. And it was it was huge to her, um, in shaping her entire worldview and stuff, and she didn't know what to believe anymore. And so all that happened, and then when the Danes arrived and raided and like killed everybody basically, and she was left alone, she was wondering, am I the reason why this happened? Did the gods abandon me and this is why this happened? And so she has a lot of baggage to sort through when she gets to the other island where she stays for most of the book. And I feel like the main part of Out of the Dark is to tell people they're not alone in whatever they're facing, because I know I felt I'm alone. She has grief to sort through, and she's so impacted by it that she turns around and says, "Okay, this was not my fault. This was um, the Dane's fault who raided my village." And so she wants revenge on him. And that is what she believes is driving her for the rest of her time there. But then slowly she starts to get back into things and realizes there's more to life than just trying to avenge something or someone. And so this book is all about like recovery and forgiveness and letting go, trusting God in both good and bad, and trying to find hope when there feels like there isn't any hope. It's about uh yeah, forgiveness and trying to find find something to live for again and after something bad happens. And sometimes we feel like there is nothing to live for after something happens, and so, uh, it was really hard for me um, to write all that because I had to sort through all my own stuff too. So, alright, now we get to the really fun part of talking about things. Let's go here now. So, who were the Vikings? Just just guess. Throw out some guesses there. When you think of Vikings, do you think of maybe these people? From, you know what? I'm gonna expand this. Yeah, there we go. That looks way better. Alright, do you think of these guys in like black leather and a shield maiden there and like black makeup and tattoos and all this stuff? That's how I feel like most people think of them. Or do you think of them as these guys? That's definitely how I thought of them when I first got into this. I love that picture so much. All right, so I'm going to start out with where were they from? So let me see. Can I get a little pointer? Is that a pointer? Laser pointer. Oh, oh, there it is. All right, so if you see my little laser pointer, the Vikings lived mostly right here, and you can see by this key here, this is Norwegian people, and then here were the Danes, and here were the Swedish. And it is insane all the places they went. These people went all the way over here. These people went down here, and there's a ton of raids going all the way even to Italy. They went to Iceland, Greenland, even America, and it was pretty crazy. Like, you can see even over here, the Swedish people went all the way over here. So they went all over the place. So I want to do an overview of the Viking Age, the main events that happened, the main time period, and most people say that it spanned from 793 to 1066 AD. And so basically, the Vikings, as we know them, were seafaring people. They were raiders, traders, explorers. They mostly raided Christian monasteries and settlements because a lot of the times the monasteries had a ton of jewels and money and gold and stuff there that they wanted. And so we'll start with all the main events here. 793 AD, there was a raid on Lindisfarne. I'm probably butchering that. Lindisfarne in northeast England. And most people say that this is the mark of the beginning of the Viking Age. And then in 830 was the Oseberg's ship. And I did not know this, but it was the burial of two women. And so here's the Oseberg ship. It is super cool. I love that swirl there. I believe it's being kept in Normandy in France. Like there's a museum there, and this is it. I don't know if you guys can see on your own screen, just because it's probably really small for you guys. But there's so much detail down here. I just love that ship so much. It's so beautiful. And then in the 830s, there were settlements in Ireland where a bunch of Vikings moved there. And then 844, they invaded Spain. And the Spanish Muslims actually were the ones to push them out of Spain, which I learned about that in school, but it's been a while, so I was like, huh, that's interesting. And then 860, they discovered Iceland, but they wouldn't settle it until 874. And then here's the famous King Alfred. He defeated the Danes in 890 because they had been the Danes had been attacking England for many, many years. They started in 878, you can see there. And this picture here is a picture of King Alfred. I think he just looks so cool. And then in the 900s, the Vikings traded with the Byzantine Empire. That is insane to me because we think, oh, people didn't travel back in the Dark Ages or in the Viking Age. Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. And they did indeed travel a lot because the Byzantine Empire is down where like Hungary and Turkey are, I believe, near the Black Sea. So that is crazy. And then in 911, they founded Normandy, and their chief Rollo was given land by the Franks because the Franks were like, please stop raiding us. We'll give you this land. You can stay here, but please stop raiding us. And so they stopped raiding them and they settled down, and that's where Normandy came from. And the word Normandy actually comes from the Normans, the Northmen. And so I just thought that was cool. And then in 941, the Rus, so the Rus were the Swedish Vikings, that's another name for them, were the Rus. They attacked Constantinople. Like, again, they went all the way down there. And then in 981, Eric the Red, which is the left picture here, that is a statue of him in Greenland. He discovered Greenland and he was like, hey guys, it's Greenland, let's go settle there. And so they went. They must have been so disappointed. They were like, what is this? But 3,000 Vikings lived there as farmers in two different settlements for a while. And then Olaf Tryggvason, the king of Sweden, was the first Swedish king, Viking king, to build a Christian church in Norway. He built the first one. And allegedly he converted to Christianity through something. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe it's because he was wounded in battle and this monk told him it's because God was protecting you. And so that, along with the other things, he came to Christianity. And then in 1000, Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, here, he was Christian. And so when he led his own Vikings, his own people, to Iceland and Greenland, Christianity spreads there. Then eventually they try to settle in North America in what they called Vinland because of all the grapes that they found, supposedly. And people don't really know exactly why they abandoned it. Maybe it was harsh weather, maybe it was natives. We're not sure. But they had to abandon it in 1015, which is kind of sad because what would have it been like if white people already lived in North America before Christopher Columbus came over, you know? That would be really interesting to see how that would have played out. Then 1066, Harold Hardrada, also called Harold Fairhair, he was defeated by King Harold of England in a battle. But then King Harold of England was defeated by William the Conqueror not not very long after that battle that he successfully fought. And William the Conqueror was a descendant of Viking settlers in Normandy. Um, and so this tapestry here is telling the story of the Battle of Hastings, and you can see Harold, Rex, something another est. So Harold is king of England, basically. But I just thought it was very interesting that he was a descendant of the Vikings and then he made it to the English throne. And so they had a huge impact on history. And soon after that, Vikings started settling down and stopped raiding when they converted to Christianity. And actually, if you did not know, the term Viking means raider, pirate, if you will. They did not call themselves that. It was a verb, to go Viking. That's why they're called Vikings now. Other people called them Vikings. Alright, so this is the fun part after we got that history out of the way. How did they live? Well, you can see it in this picture here. Here's some Viking settlements. There is Birka. You might recognize that. There's Birka. There's Oslo, Kalpeng. Um, I referenced that in my book. There's one all the way up there. There's Ribe and there's Lund. Let me see, what others do I recognize? Well, there are lots of Viking settlements that we know about. And so Vikings were mostly farmers. They were not all raiders. They were also merchants, craftsmen, fishermen. There were so many different crafts that they did. Like, some people were blacksmiths, some people were weavers, some were chainmail makers. Like, they earned bank back then because chainmail was really expensive. And I just thought this was very interesting. Families all lived together in one house. Grandparents, parents, children. I wasn't able to find out online. Maybe there's stuff available now, but I wasn't able to find out when they moved on into a new house. Because when a girl got married, she went and lived with her husband, right? So did they get a new house or did they stay in their parents' house? I'm not sure. I wish I knew. That would be interesting. But they had their own work. The men worked outside in the fields, they hunted, fished, etc., fixed everything. Women worked inside most of the time, but they also tended their gardens. They cooked, cleaned, sewed, mended, wove, all that kind of stuff. But in the wintertime, everyone worked inside. And you can imagine that huge family in one house for the entire winter. That would be rough. Oh, I read complaints by the Vikings. They hated it. At one point in time, they just get sick of it, after a while. And so they have all these outdoor activities, but we'll get to those in a minute. But I'm not trying to romanticize the Vikings' life because it was hard. They had to make everything by hand from scratch, and it was not an easy life. Right. So here's just a few foods and drinks that they had. They had water, wine, beer, and mead. Yes, they did drink water. Um, they also drank milk, but most of the time it was in the form of skyr, which I've heard the Icelandic peoples still eat skyr, which is a sour goat cheese that's kind of eaten like yogurt. Um, you can also water it down so that it's kind of like milk, but it's more like sour milk. They also had scots, which is cabbage stew, and they had a wide variety of meats. They had chicken, pork, deer, cattle, sometimes even horse meat. Only the rich people did that. And that's actually something that stopped when they converted to Christianity because the monks and the evangelists were just like, that is very barbaric. We don't want you to do that. And so the converts were like, okay, we'll stop. Um, but I just think that's very interesting. I'm not sure. Fish was a huge staple for the Vikings because in the wintertime, near the spring, is when most of their stores were low and they only had fish left to eat, basically. The Icelandic cod, um, more specifically, was their staple, what they really needed. Like, they could not survive without it. And they could preserve fish in many ways, including fried, boiled, dried. They could put it in soups, stews, other places. And the Vikings did have honey. They used honey as a sweetener. And again, with the rich versus poor, the richer you were, the more often you used honey. Most people would have probably only put it in desserts or things like that, just for special occasions, but the rich people could have used it every day, I'm sure. They yeah, that just sounds weird saying it out loud. Scavenged berries. They had uh, raspberries, they had, I believe, strawberries, blueberries, they had um, little like berry bushes, things like that, that they would go forage. And their flatbread is very interesting. They would um, put it in like flat loaves and then they would bake it on a metal tray or maybe just right in the coals and it would rise. They would flip them, you know, flatbread. Or they would do honey cakes, like the same recipe, but put honey in it and make it really sweet. And their bread was usually made of oats, millet, rye, barley, or wheat. Barley was the most common, I believe. Wheat was a little more scarce. Uh, before I dug into their type of grains that they ate, I didn't know they had millet. So I'm not sure how common that was. But barley, yes, that was absolutely common, and as were oats. And as for their vegetables, they had tons of vegetables. They had raised garden beds where they would grow things. Look it up. They had raised garden beds, and in those things, they would grow onions, carrots, turnips, cabbage, beets, etc. Like, there are so many vegetables. They were not missing out on that. And then, of course, oatmeal. They would eat porridge. And that was a big staple of their diet also. So like a typical meal for a Viking would be flatbread, vegetables, maybe cooked or something, and then they would also have oatmeal. I wonder if they ate it more in the morning. That would be interesting. There's just so much we don't know, so much that is speculated too. Then also they would have a meat of some sort. Some type of meat, some type of fish. It might sound boring to some people, but actually it was way better than what the Europeans ate at that time. The Vikings were so much more healthy than the Europeans. They still had a ton of stuff that we're not going to talk about, like worms, different diseases. It's gross. I don't want to talk about it, so we're not going to. But in spite of all that, they were healthier than the Europeans. So, family life. The girls tended to get married off at age 15 to 20, and the boys were 18 or older, depending on their work status and stuff. And marriages could be arranged or they could be voluntary. The process was first courtship, engagement, and then marriage. And something that shocked me was that girls had a say in this process. So when the guy first asked the dad if he could court the girl, the dad would call the girl and say like, "Hey, this guy wants to court you." And the girl could say yes, like, "Yeah, that's totally fine. I don't mind marrying you," because back then courtship led to marriage. It was kind of disgraceful to break off a courtship even. But the girl could say no. Some sources say that she could say no up to 3 times, and then after that, her family's like, "Okay, no, you gotta marry somebody. You gotta marry this guy because it's your 3rd time." Um, and they had a pretty typical family structure. The husband was the head of the household, and women were in charge of the house. Um, I've heard that they carried the keys to the house and to the different buildings on their belt, and so they were considered the housekeeper, like, they were in charge of everything, with the house, which I find is very interesting. It was a lot to take care of. Something else that I thought was interesting is women had equal rights as men. They could vote for different things. They had property rights. When a woman was married, her husband would do all the property rights and stuff because she was provided for. But if the woman was unmarried or widowed and she didn't marry again, she had the same property rights as men because she was not being cared for. So I thought that was very interesting, and also that those widows and unmarried women could participate in meetings just like the men. They could speak up and say, "Well, I think this," or something like that. And children were brought up by their parents and grandparents. So this is just me speculating. I think the grandparents would have had a lot to do with the children's upbringing. Just because the grandparents are kind of older, and so they can't do as much. I bet they would have a lot to do with the children being raised and stuff. Something else that I thought was fascinating was that the older people, were greatly respected and cared for, even if, let's say, a widow has no family left. No brothers, no sisters, no cousins, or anything like that. Someone else would take her into their home and care for her. So the elderly were always cared for. And I think that is just amazing. Like, we need to start doing that more in our own society. All right, games. So this picture here is a picture of Nefelteffel, which is often called Viking chess, but it is not chess. Let me say that again. It's called chess, but it is not chess. Okay? Not chess. This is different. And interesting, to me at least, is that the word Nefelteffel means king's table. So I'll use my pointer here. Here is the defenders team. That's one team. And then these red people are the attackers. And the king is in the middle here. And the goal of the defenders is to get their king to one of these squares over here in the corners to keep their king safe. And then they win the game if they're able to do that. And then the attackers, if they're able to surround the king, they win. And I've actually made a Nefelteffel board of my own and played it with my siblings. It is so much fun. Something else they did during the winter is skiing. They loved skiing so much. Skiing, ice skating. They even made a god for ice skating, for skiing. I just thought that was hilarious. And then they had Nadalik, something like that. It's another outdoor game. They love outdoor games. And some people say it's similar to field hockey, but we're not sure. Then there's ice fishing, another winter game. They would stand in icy water for hours as kind of like a competition who can stand there the longest and catch fish. They viewed it as a fun pastime where we would probably be dying. They had tug-of-war, the adults would play tug-of-war. Basically, any kind of game that was physically demanding where they could show off their physical skills or their mental skills, they loved it. So tug-of-war, monkey in the middle, except it wasn't called that, and it was much rougher. These are strong adults who are pushing and shoving to grab the ball when it's getting thrown. They would have swimming contests. They played Nine Men's Morris, another strategy game. They had drinking games. They had races, snowball fights. They had mock battles, but a lot of the times those mock battles would become real battles, which could be dangerous. But you see, they loved entertainment. They weren't working all the time. They would take a little break for having a little fun. And then feasts, meetings were very important to the Vikings. The meetings are called tings or things. It had the little thorn symbol that's like a line with the little P like that. And let me see. Those meetings were very political. It was to solve problems, address property rights, serve justice, anything else that needed done. Uh, the frequency, how many times a year they did it, depended on the village. They could do it once a month, they could do it once a week, and if need be, they could do it spontaneously. These things were often held in a special building called a Tingstead or in a field for that purpose. And it was kind of treated as a miniature feast where they would have food and drink, but it was more geared toward the political side. The feasts, on the other hand, were huge celebrations that involved food, drink, entertainment, poetry, singing, dancing, anything you can think of. Probably some of the games that we mentioned. And it was important for social bonds too. I read that um, young men would watch the women as they like prepared food and stuff, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, she's a very capable lady. I want to marry her." So it was for like, many times marriages would be held afterwards just because they're like, "Hey, I like you." So they also had their seasonal feasts, which are called blots. They had the Sommermal, which was held in the spring, then Midsummer, which is for the for the summer solstice, then Offerblot, which is for harvest. Do I want to say that? Veterinator. Veterinator. I don't. I'm sorry, I can't say it. This word here. It's for winter nights, and then Midvetter, which is Yule. And that was typically done for the winter solstice. So you've probably heard of Yule, like, make the Yuletide gay. That's where we get Yule. And there's also a feast that they have called Siegerblot, which is a victory sacrifice. And this would oftentimes involve human sacrifices of the thralls that were captured during battle. It was kind of gruesome. And they would also do feasts for voyages, weddings, births, even for hospitality. The Vikings were known for their hospitality. There's even a line um, in one of their songs that talk about if there's a journey person among you and they need stuff, you bring them into your home, you feed them, you give them something nice to wear if they need it, you set them before your fire, and you help them out. Even let them stay for a day or two. So I didn't want to go into all the beliefs just because it's so complicated, but there's tons of resources out there. You can go check it out in greater detail if you want to. but they believed that there was a hierarchy of gods in a place called Asgard, and that was the realm of the gods. And Earth was called Midgard, where all the people lived. And so, just a few of the more famous gods was Odin, who was the All Father. Um, you may have heard of him and Thor and Loki from the Avengers. You might have heard of them. Freya was the god of love and beauty. Thor was basically the people's god. The people loved him. He was the god of thunder, of storms, of protection, of big trees, I've also read too. And he wielded, yes, the huge hammer Mjolnir. So there's some great stories about him and his hammer. Some of which are pretty hilarious. And then of course there's Loki, who is the trickster god. He The other gods kind of had mixed feelings about him because he was sometimes their ally, sometimes their enemy. He went back and forth. And there was the goddess Hel, who was in charge of Helheim, which was the underworld. Their religion was more of one of superstitions. They had sacred sites, they had feasts and prayers, pendants, symbols, sacrifices, and the sacred sites they thought were sacred, and they had feasts devoted to their gods, like the victory sacrifice we just talked about a minute ago. And the pendants is very interesting because they believed that they had special abilities or were for like good luck, all lots of superstitions. And this picture right here is what people nowadays would call the Tree of Life picture, but actually the Vikings had their own tree. It was the world tree. I can't remember the name for it, the Norse name, but it was the tree that connected all 9 realms together. Uh, and then the world serpent would be at its roots. And so that's what that is. And then here's a pendant. This is a typical pendant from the Viking age. See, it kind of has like an animal head right here, and it's in the shape of Mjolnir. Like I said, people loved Thor, they loved Mjolnir because he was a god of the people. Right, so I wanted to briefly cover the difference between Danish, Norse, and Swedish Vikings. So the Danes were conquerors, okay? They were conquerors who raided to expand their territory. As you can see, they're in this tiny little area here. They were some of the most feared because they took over and they would stay in that place. They wouldn't just come and go. Um, they most often killed everybody just because they were conquering and they were there to stay. They wanted to get rid of the people who lived there. Sometimes they would keep them alive for tribute, and sometimes they kept them as thralls too. Thralls are slaves that were captured in battle. And then we have the Norse, who are probably the most popular ones, just because Norsemen is pretty common when talking about Vikings, but they are from Norway, and they were explorers and raiders, and they raided for wealth and supplies. I don't know what their problem was, but they loved raiding just for the fun of it. And they were they were the ones who had the berserkers. So you've probably heard someone say, "Well, that was berserk," you know? And nowadays that means like really strange, right? Like out of the ordinary. But berserkers were greatly feared because they were ruthless in battle, and they would just like when battle starts, like, they would go crazy. They usually didn't wear any armor, and they would just thrash around like swinging their swords and stuff. They were very destructive, And a lot of people nowadays think that they had PTSD from other battles because they reacted that way, and I kind of feel bad for them, but they were really terrifying. Then the Swedish or the Rus were mostly traders, and they didn't raid as much. They only raided when necessary, like when their crops weren't doing so good, when they needed more wealth, more money, they would go raid people. They were they were the more friendly ones. Right. I don't think anyone can talk about Vikings without talking about raids and battles. So, like I already mentioned, Vikings raided for food and for wealth, and they preferred surprise attacks, which is not surprising in itself. They would fight on land, at sea, and like that one picture that I showed at the very beginning about their expand, is because of their boats, which we'll talk about in a minute. Their boats were amazing for sneak attacks. They could go up rivers easily because they were so shallow. And the battles were very brutal. There have been battlefield finds of like Vikings who had several fatal injuries before they dropped dead. Like they would be like filled with spears or arrows. They would have shattered arms and legs but still keep fighting. Like I can't imagine, but their goal was to sell their life as precious as possible because they believed that if they fought well enough, they would be chosen to go to Valhalla, which is the hall of the warriors, where they would feast with the gods every night. And then they would all kill each other in battle, just fun, and then raise up the next day and do it all over again. But they're for shield maidens are like a legend for fantasy Viking things. There have been finds of shield maidens, mostly from their burials. We find them and we think, oh, this was a mighty man warrior. And then we do some DNA tests. No, it was a woman. And so they did participate in there. I did a little research on shield maidens, and people believe that they became shield maidens because they didn't want to marry somebody, and they're like, oh, if I'm a shield maiden, I don't need to marry anybody. Or if they were like a disgrace to their family for some reason and they wanted to win honor back. Honor was very important to the Vikings. Then I already talked about berserkers. I don't think I need to go on about them again. So their armor, their helmets did not have horns. No horns, okay? No horns. This picture here is a picture of a Norse helmet that was found, and it is in pieces, basically. It looks like that guy just got, like, jammed in the head. Ugh. The reason why we think Vikings had horned helmets, uh, first came from this one helmet that was found in Germany, wrong people, that had horns, but it was for ceremonies, not for battle. And then in the 1800s, there were these plays where, for their costumes, the Viking actors were given helmets with wings or horns. So that's why we think of horns on helmets for Vikings. So they, for their actual armor, they had chainmail uh, for the more wealthy, because I mentioned before, chainmail was expensive. If you want to show your wealth, get chainmail. Because all those tiny little links are like handmade and hand like put together, and it is it's just mind blowing, and it was expensive. Like that would break the bank for someone who was not wealthy enough. So because of that, there have been finds of metal plates. So it's just sheet armor that was just a sheet of metal linked to another sheet of metal, mostly to cover your torso, not really for your arms or anything else. There it is possible that they wore leather armor. There have been finds of some helmets that were lined with leather just so that, it's not just wearing a pot on your head. That's what it would feel like, just because it's so hard and stuff. So it was lined with leather, but it was not the black studded leather that you see in movies. It looks cool, not accurate. They did not wear it. And sometimes they wore no armor at all, like for the berserkers. But also, if you couldn't afford armor, and some Vikings just preferred not wearing armor because they thought it hindered their battle skills. So here is a picture of some chainmail here, close up, and then here's some more over here. You can see he has chainmail pants. These are some reenactors, and of course they're reenacting for very wealthy Vikings. Right, their boats. I just thought that was such a cool picture. So their boats could travel 15 to 20 knots, which is 17 to 23 miles per hour. That's actually really, really fast for a boat back then. And their boats were symmetrical uh, in the front and the back, as you can see here, so that they could turn around without turning around. They could reverse direction. So they're sailing along here. Oh, we don't want to go that way. They just start rowing the opposite way. Very convenient. And depending on the wealth of the owner, the boats could be very highly decorated. As you can see, this has a dragon head and lots of carving here. And also the Oseberg ship also had tons of carving. And their food that they would eat on voyages was cooked before going on the boat. Nothing was cooked on board. And their typical food there was fish, meat, and they would drink water or beer. But it doesn't give you much variety. You better not be going on a long voyage because I would get sick of that. And something else I thought was interesting was that there was no captain's cabin. See, there's no captain's cabin here. If it was the captain's ship, they would have like a tent like right here near the mast. So that's an overview of their boats. And here's the different kinds of boats. They had a fairing, which is the most common boat. It is also the smallest. It had 2 pairs of oars, so 4 altogether, 2 rowers. It was a rowboat, which is hilarious thinking of the Vikings having rowboats, but it's true. And some of them could carry a small sail to kind of boost them forward a little bit. And there was a carvy, which is the smallest of the bigger boats. There were about 13 rowing benches, so that would be 26 oars, I would say. And these were used for trade, fishing, possibly military, but we don't have much evidence on that. And then the sneka. It looks cool written down, but it does not sound cool saying it because it sounds like snake. And that's exactly what it means. It means snake. And it is the smallest military boat with about 20 rowing benches. And it was about 17 feet long or so. And it was often stored on shore because it was very lightweight. And they would put them on the beach. They would have boat houses just for their boats. And it looks like this could have been a sneka, but yeah, it looks like a sneka. Yeah. I was gonna say it was a skate, but I don't think it's big enough. Alright, so the skate is the largest known longboat with 30 plus rowing benches. That is insane. So if you have 30 rowing benches, that's about 60 um 60 oars there, and that is huge, and it could hold 70 to 80 men. So, like, how they would do it in wars is that they would have the rower, and then they would have a shield person. Let's go back. So you see all the shields here? They could hang them on the side, but then also the oarsmen in battle, they would be rowing, then there would be people, one person per shield, and then there would be one other person to shoot arrows, throw spears, things like that. And then the Drakkar, the dragon ship, like the legendary dragon ship, is under speculation because there's no evidence for it except for in sagas. Uh, and also, we have not found any, but that doesn't mean they couldn't have existed. So we we can be open to that, but it is not likely that they actually existed. Then the last one is a nar. It's a transportation boat, kind of like a barge nowadays, but this was not nearly as big as a barge. It's for people and goods. It had a long, deep, wide hull where it would store 24 tons of stuff. That is a lot for a wooden boat. It transported wool, timber, wheat, walrus ivory, honey, and slaves. And other stuff too. They would also transport silk, but I'll get into silk in a minute. Oh yeah, I just remember what I was going to say about the boats. They were built in such a way, especially the Sneka, because they used those most often on raids. They built them flexible so that they could bend without breaking or letting in any water. I just thought that was fascinating how they did that, how they figured that out. So, this is my favorite part of learning about the Vikings is their personal appearance. So hygiene was a huge thing in Viking times. They took a ton of pride in their appearance. And unlike the stereotype about Vikings, they were not filthy. To our standards, yes, but they were not like disgustingly filthy. They washed daily. They would wash their hands, faces, necks, and hair every day, and then they would bathe their whole body weekly. And actually, our day for Saturday comes from their word lagerdager, which means to bathe. And they would do that on Saturday. Most Europeans hardly bathed at all. And so to the Europeans, um, the Vikings were so clean. So that gives you a little perspective here. And there have been hygiene kits found, and these kits would go on the belts so that you can carry it around. There were combs, tweezers, razors, and even ear spoons. That is what this is a picture of. It is a Viking ear spoon. That was too good for me to leave out. I just, I love it so much. And there's actually this account of this Arab who went in Northern Europe and he visited the Vikings. And it was disgusting to him just because the Arabs, the Muslims, washed regular throughout the day. But he said that in the morning, this maid would come in and have this bowl of water. She would pass it around to everybody, and everyone would wash their face, wash their um, hair, and wash their beard if they were a guy. They would blow their nose in it, and then she would pass it to the next person without changing the water. That is disgusting. But it's more than what the Europeans did. So you gotta give that to them. And in the chronicle that John of Wallingford wrote, he said that the English women preferred Viking men to Englishmen because Viking men were well groomed. They would style their hair, style their beards. They were clean and they were big and strong because of their good diets. And so some women would actually run away with the Vikings when the Vikings raided, and they would become their wives and stuff. And I just thought that was hilarious. The English people should have done a better job if they didn't want that happening. And here's a picture of a comb that was found. It looks very similar to one that I actually have. Except not this beat down because this is a Viking find. And here's a section from the Havamal that talks about hygiene. It says, if you travel clean and fed to a public place, you shall not feel shame about what you have or do not have. So it's basically saying that your personal appearance is more important than your status, how much you have. Like, you need not be ashamed of how poor or rich you are if you are well groomed and, and clean. Clothing! So here's a lovely picture of Viking reenactors, both men and women, and there's a child in the background there. Most of the clothes were linen and wool, and they would wear many layers. You can just see here, I'm seeing at least 3 layers on this lady. So here's the underdress, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 layers here. And this guy's wearing a cloak, so they wear lots of layers, especially when it's cold out. And they did not wear gray and black all the time like you see in the movies. That's where How to Train Your Dragon actually gets it right. Also with the hygiene. In How to Train Your Dragon, they were clean, and there were lots and lots of colors. Keep that in mind next time you watch it. Vikings had blues, greens, yellows, orange, red, and they even had purple too. That wasn't as common, but they did have purple. And red was actually a rich color. It was for richer people. And I could tell just by looking at these ladies' jewelry that they were wealthy. You can see here lots and lots of jewels. They loved wearing all their jewelry. And they would also have silk embroidery. They wouldn't have full garments of silk because they couldn't get enough of it for that, but they would embroider different designs like on the collar or the sleeves of their dresses or their tunics and stuff. And they had leather shoes. They did have shoes and belts. You can see they had, this guy is wearing boots here that go above the ankle. And then this lady here has ones that go below the ankle. These were more typical. Guys would wear these more often than women would, according to some resources. But women could wear those too. Alright, so here's a men's outfit. So they would do their hair. Their hair would be shoulder length or below. It could be short. They would tie it back, they would braid it. Sometimes they would do a man bun, and oftentimes they would bleach their hair with special soap. To bust another Viking myth, they were not all blonde. Back then, most of them were brown haired, but they would bleach their hair blonde because they thought it attractive. So I was laughing the other day because I thought, what if a Viking man was like, oh no, I need to touch up my roots because they're brown. The rest of my hair is blonde. Oh no. And they were very prideful of their beards. They would have full beards. Like, if you've seen How to Train Your Dragon, I know I'm referencing it a lot, but if you remember Stoic, the really big guy, his beard, it's not a huge exaggeration. They would have really full big beard. Like, this is not cutting it. This isn't either. But if you're a reenactor, I don't know if you wanna go around with a full stoic beard all the time, but they would braid it, they would gather it in, like, l I don't know, like a braid ponytail. Their clothing, the first layer was called a skirta. It's their undershirt, and on this guy, you can see a little bit over here. That would often be linen. And then they would have a jerkin, which is this red layer here, or this guy's blue layer. This looks like his skirta here. They could layer several of these jerkins if they were really cold. Um, I put slash kirtle because jerkin was like the shorter ones, but then they could also have longer ones, and I guess that would be called a kirtle. Then they would have trousers. They could be really baggy. They could be, I don't know, more tailored, but most of the time they would look like this. And then they would have leg wraps. I just think those are so cool. Really neat. And then they would have stockings and boots. You can sorta see his boots there, but we already discussed them. And then they would have belts and accessories of all kinds on there. So he has a belt here with his pouch and knife. He has a horn back here. They did not actually drink out of horns, just so you know. But he has a couple necklaces here. Necklaces were common for both men and women. You see Mjolnir, there's something else there. Then he has a bracelet and he has a ring. Vikings loved bling. Vikings loved accessories. And then they would have a cloak or hood if they were cold. And here there's a pendulum brooch. I'm probably saying that wrong. I think I am. There's two of them to keep it on them real well. And then here's another one, another way to wear it. And I already discussed the accessories, rings, necklaces, brooches, armbands, etc. Basically, anywhere they could hang something, they would put it there. Here's another picture. I feel like these guys did a really good job. I love the hem down here and the collar up here. Those were often tablet woven and had beautiful designs on them. And over here we can see his belt has a like a sword or something, maybe a hatchet. I'm not sure what that is. Please don't blow me up in the comments. Here are his leg wraps, and here's his boots. You can see his boots real well here. And they actually did wear hats. They did wear hats, and I love his hat here. Alright, now for the women. Obviously, I'm more interested in this because I'm a woman. So, the Viking women would have their hair loose or tied back. They would be braided. They would do buns. They would do wraparound braids, kind of like milkmaid braids, you know. And they would wear head coverings. But this is very controversial in that it's hard to tell when they wore it, how often. Some resources say they wore them all the time. Others say that they wore them only when working, when their hair would get dirty. Others say the wife of the guy would wear it because Viking men would have other women also, not just his wife. But some people say that the wife would be the only one to wear it. I don't think that one is exactly accurate. Um, I think it would be more of when they're working. So that's what I did in my book. So this was a real historic gray area because we don't really know. But the first layer was the cirque, kind of like the men's undershirt. This is the, well, doesn't look like I can see any here. But then the kirtle is their outer garment, and that's this blue one right here. This blue one here, just like then they would layer these. And here's this. Here's a really nice herringbone detail. And then the brooch, that's actually a three-pronged brooch. Legend has it that the Norsemen went down to France and they saw French sword guards. The sword guards were three-pronged, and they took them back and were like, "Hey, we want to make a brooch out of this." And here's the typical tortoise brooch that you think of when you think of women's stuff. And here's some more here. There's a really big one right here. This would be very elaborate. And then they had their smocker, which is their apron dress. It's this one right here, the purple. I think that's a lovely color right there. They had these straps, and then the straps were actually not connected to the front. That's what the brooch would be there for. You would pull the strap over and then use the brooch to pin the top of the smoker to the strap and keep it all nice and secure. That's what that was for. And then they would also have stockings and boots. This lady is wearing some boots here. And then they had belts and their belt accessories. Like this one has a knife, and they would have the hygiene kits too. They would have a knife, they would have shears, they would have anything that they needed basically for everyday work. I also mentioned the keys earlier to different buildings that they had. They would keep those on there. Imagine all the noise it would make when you walk around. It would be like a constant jangle, 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 jangle. And then they would have a cloak, shawl, hood, things of that sort. And so this lady is wearing a cloak, and then she has a little fox skin here. They would actually wear the fur on the inside because the fur is what would keep you warm more often. And yes, they would have hats here, things of that sort. And then they would have other accessories like the necklaces, like here. Then they would have the string of beads between their brooches. They would have pins, hair pins, and hair combs. It would have rings, armbands. I can't find anymore. These ladies are kind of under accessorized. Let's see what the other pictures are. There we go. Here's some more bling. Here's bling. Yay. You see her belt is very elaborate. And so I'm not sure if this pattern would have been common. Like this is a very rich lady. I just loved this because of the hat. Because of the hat and all the bling that she has and this coat, they would have coats too. Um, and I liked this picture because here's this could be the Serk, and then here's a short sleeved kirtle. This was more common in the summertime, so you're not wearing a full woolen layer in the summertime. And a tapestry woven belt. And so that is the full presentation, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something. This was a lot of fun for me to share with you guys. So for your own resources, if you want to go check things out, here are my favorite resources. Most of these, the information that I got was from these. Vikings of Bjornstad is a reenactors group. There's Life in Norway, and this website has several articles on Vikings that I found very helpful. The Viking Herald is so good. Look it up. And the Welsh Viking on YouTube, he's a little more um, liberal than I would prefer to watch, but he has some really good information. So just keep that in mind. He says and does some things that are not exactly appropriate all the time, but I love his resources. So just a caution for you guys. I watch him if there's stuff that I can only find there. His earlier videos are better. And then I love to use sagas for information also. In my Viking book, you'll find a lot of poetry that's recited. Those were actual sagas and stuff, like the Volsung saga, that one, and then the Havamal, other ones as well. So, in order to find your own resources, you need to make sure that it references real finds, and just as like a just to make sure that they're not making stuff up. And make sure they also have accurate information. Compare it to the resources that I shared. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know I did. Need to get back to this. Where is this? I can't find it. There we go. Alright. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun for me to share. I hope you check out my book and the other things that I do, my other videos. So if you go over to my website and look at the link that I have there, you'll be able to get your own free chapter of things from my book. And I hope that you guys like it and enjoy it. And if you do, please leave a comment and a like. That would really help me. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.